Welcome back to another episode of High Side, Low Side, the motorcycle podcast with Mr. Zach Kortz and myself, Spurgeon Dunbar, at the helms of these lovely microphones.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. Spurgeon, we got so much to cover. What are we covering today? Talk us through.
We've got T-shirts, we've got news, we've got Spenser Roberts joining us again. For those of you that are looking back on season 4, Spenser was the one that joined us as we talked about motorcycles and movies. He is now going to be joining us as we dive into the best and worst looking motorcycles ever. I think this is going to be a pretty hot button topic of an issue because I think everybody has their own idea of what makes a good looking bike or a bad looking bike.
Sure. Very subjective. I'm very interested. Just for you viewers and listeners, we have not talked about this with each other. We've done our own research. We've compiled our little lists. So we're coming in sort of blind. So all of the arguments that we have not had before. Promise.
I'm waiting to see what you find to be a pretty motorcycle, an ugly motorcycle. Which ones you've owned. I'm very interested in diving into this one.
Yeah. Same. So. That being said, we got to get through the housekeeping stuff as soon as we can, and get Spenser on here and start talking about what motorcycles are good looking and what motorcycles aren't, because that's what everyone's looking forward to. As usual, tip of the cap to our sponsor, Motul. I would just like to say, as always, that Motul helps us with the production cost of this show. As always, it is a very unprofessional outfit, but it does cost money to put this all together and to pay our producer Chase's exorbitant salary. So thanks to Motul for supporting High Side, Low Side. If you need oil, lubricant, cleaners for your motorcycle and you want to support High Side, Low Side, you can in turn support Motul.
And just a quick note here, a congratulations to our producer Chase, who managed to have a baby. Well, he's with child. His girlfriend is with child, so he's going to need even more of that Motul money now with a third mouth to feed. So
true.
You know, we really do appreciate all of the Motul dollars that are rolling in to not just help us run a podcast, but make sure that Chase's soon-to-be unborn child is well fed.
That's very true. And I assume one of these days Spurgeon will actually send me the Motul product that he keeps promising, and I will know myself how good the product is.
I've got so much. So it's actually really interesting. I've got not only do I have a giant box of Motul products for you, but I've started to get Instagram questions from people who have, like Motul questions as to like which Motul oil is right for their bikes and such. So I'm starting to like just become more of the resident Motul expert on staff too when it comes time to like figure out what oil you should be using from Motul. So yeah, go ahead and send me those Instagram questions apparently, and I'll keep just answer them away.
Quick plug to Aries' YouTube program, The Shop Manual, which I think there's something about what oil you should use in your motorcycle. I think that's a thing that exists. Anyway, lots of resources there if you are not familiar with The Shop Manual on YouTube. So let's give away some T-shirts. Spurgeon Dunbar, you want to take the first one? I'll take the second one.
How do you win a T-shirt, Zach?
Good question. I thought you'd never ask. You can leave a review on Apple Podcasts, and we will comb through both of those reviews, and we'll pick our favorite, and give away a T-shirt to someone who leaves a comment that we find particularly funny, insightful, touching. I don't know. Any number of emotions can crop up in our tiny little brains. So, point being, go to Apple Podcasts, leave a review. If you do so, you may be selected to win a T-shirt. And in this case, winners,
we picked both the reviews that were left for us this time around. So we got Trobin S6 is Trobin S6.
You don't think that's T Robbins?
No, it's Trobin's.
Oh, it's Trobin S6.
Trobin S6. It probably, he did sign his name Tim, parentheses the old guy at the end, so it probably is T Robbins 6. So you're right, and again, thank you for pointing that out to all of our listeners that I am horrible at these random names that people make up. But
okay, so Tro by NS6 said,
old T Robbins 6 says, great show, but you youngsters missed the era of change from right side shifting to left, or from hand shifting to foot shifting.
And this, sorry, just really quick. This is in reference to the live episode, I believe, where we talked about eras in motorcycling, and Tim Robbins, presumably the actor Tim Robbins, has written in to tell us that we missed. We didn't talk about this one era.
But so I guess my question is, we talked about like the 60s and the 70s, and this was an era which I think it was 74 or 75 where everything went very universal in America.
Was it that late?
I thought it was like I thought it was early 70s where like, because that's when the British bikes had to shift over, because the British bikes were the
true. Yeah, with right hand shift and left hand shift certainly. Yeah. But the hand shift foot shift thing kind of, I think Harley settled on that in the early 50s or something like that.
Yeah.
Well, so this is a good great letter, and we very much appreciate the call out to that shift and things. I would like to say I am old enough. Well, I raced vintage motorcycles, so I am old enough to be familiar with this to a certain extent. I may have mentioned this on the podcast once before, come to think of it, but I'll give myself the old humble brag anyway. When I was racing vintage motorcycles, I actually on the same day raced a motorcycle that was GP shift on the left side of the bike, and then I raced a sidecar that I piloted, which was street shift on the left side of the bike, and then I raced a vintage Ducati, which was right side street shift. So I'm familiar with right hand shift.
All on the same day or the same weekend?
Same day. All on the same day. So that is what I use my brain capacity for, and that's why I don't understand fractions or politics.
Now, what I will say is, just so the entire audience understands what you're referring to here, can you explain standard shift versus GP shift for those out there that might not know what you're referring to?
Fair enough. This came up recently as well. GP shift is a reference to the way that some racers, historically Grand Prix riders, which is where it came from, set up their shifter on the bike. So with your left foot, you of course typically reach underneath the shifter and lift up to shift from second to third or third to fourth, whatever. But racers will sometimes flip that so that you pull up on the shifter to go down from second to first or third to second, whatever, and you push down on the shifter to upshift. And that's so that when you are leaned way over like a super fast GP rider, you can still grab an upshift and you don't have to put your foot under the shifter and drag it on the ground. So it's a common technique for racers, and hence the term GP shift. So you can have the bike shift on the left side, but shift in opposite directions.
And just so everyone's clear too, Tim is referring to the fact that for a lot of times, pre the mid 70s, certain motorcycle manufacturers, instead of having the brake pedal on the right side, would actually have your gear shifter would be on the right side of the bike. So
like Ducatis and British bikes.
That's what Tim is referring to.
Right. And of course, hand shift, that goes back a little farther. But do appreciate your letter, Tim, and please do send us your preferred t-shirt size and your mailing address so we can send you a high side, low side t-shirt. And when you wear it and people ask about it, you can say, yeah, I told those young idiots what was up. I told them what was going on.
So give us number 2 for the winner today, Zachary.
Well, I'll give you a chance to make fun of me now. I think this is iDozen.
That's how I would say it. iDozen.
iDozen.
iDozen sounds better though. iDozen is. I'm thinking it's iDozen.
I'm thinking it's iDozen. iDozen says, "I'm glad to have found your podcast. Keep up the good work, gang. Having fun with it. My brother rides a 2017 Triumph Bonneville T100, and he has successfully talked me into getting a used 2017 T120 Black as my first bike. So far, it's a lovely piece of machine. Cheers to a free high side, low side t-shirt, stocking stuffer. Happy holidays to you all." So, this is a new rider that we picked out who has found high side, low side and seems to be enjoying it. So, gosh, as always, we're suckers for a compliment. We're going to send him a t-shirt.
No, I picked it simply because my Triumph Bonneville was my first motorcycle, and so the fact that iDozen went with the T120 motorcycle as his first. It sounds like his brother's riding a T120. I like the whole Triumph Bonneville theme that they've got going on in their garages.
Or her first, right? Is there a name associated with this? It could be a sister that got this.
That's true.
So, yeah.
I just saw brother. We know that there's one boy in this family that's riding a Bonneville.
There's one boy.
Yeah.
Anyway, his or her first bike T120 Black, not unlike Spurgeon's first bike of a trumpet. So yeah, good stuff.
So congratulations to all new riders out there, but most especially to iDozen, to T Robbins 6. Make sure you send us an email to highside@RevZilla.com with your address and preferred t-shirt size, and we will get those sent out to you. Just a quick note, for those of you that have won t-shirts in the past few episodes, we're currently out of large and mediums, but I literally was messaging today, and they should be in stock within the coming week. So if you've been waiting for a t-shirt from us for a large or medium, we are aware that they're out of stock, and I would say within the next few weeks, those t-shirts will all be mailed out to you.
Presumably by the time this goes live, right? By the time this goes
Hopefully,
live, probably
yeah.
what you just about. Okay, whatever.
That's hopefully, yes.
We
You never know.
assume-
I mean, with all of the supply chain issues, you don't know what's going on. And speaking of supply chain issues, Zach, let's get into the news. What are we talking about today that's new in the world of motorcycling?
First on the list is some electric bike stuff. We like to try to have our finger on the pulse of what's going on in the world of e-bikes, and
What promises are being made, and
right. Well, that's
nothing's
mostly
being
what it
kept?
is, right? Those of you familiar with high side, low side know that we often, say stuff like, just like I don't want to hear more vaporware, like, promises of how cool this electric bike's going to be in a prototype, like build it, put it on sale so we can ride it and try it, and then we'll see how it is instead of telling us about it. So a couple of notes on that topic. One is this story we tripped over about an Army parachute regiment doing a trial of electric bikes with paratroopers. So they're like 100-pound electric motorcycles that are being dropped with the paratroopers, so that they have somewhere, I think it was 50 or 60 miles of range on these little 100-pound electric motorcycles. They kind of look like a beefed up mountain bike with an electric motor, but kind of a neat idea.
So just for some clarity on this, it's the British Army, not the American Army, that's doing this. And I did some research into the claim of the 60-mile range on this. So the top speed of these bikes is about 45 miles an hour, roughly like 29 foot-pounds of torque. But the range drops drastically when they're not ridden conservatively. And what I like about this is they gave they didn't just do some like tiny little British test rider on there that weighs 100 pounds. When they threw a 220-pound rider on there with his gear loaded on, the range dropped to about 25 miles. And one of the things they were talking about was they haven't had motorcycles in the British Army for about 10 years at this point. They're testing these to see if they can start using these in situations to get behind enemy lines. But the problem they're facing right now is that cold and altitude has a drastic effect on lithium batteries. And,
Altitude does?
Well, apparently they explode. They can,
really?
they can catch on fire. Like battery. That's why like you're supposed to not put batteries into the cargo hold of the plane.
Right.
Because they're pressurized.
And at the very least, cold is a problem, which often
for range. So one is like
is
fire, and the other
exacerbated
one's
at
range.
altitude anyway. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, interesting.
So-
yeah, well, I mean, what do you make of this, Burge? I think it's the kind of thing where sometimes when military starts spending money on stuff, things happen a little quicker because they actually, refine things. I don't think this is something that's going to trickle down to consumers in a way that matters all that much, but I think it's a neat idea. It's not the first time parachuting soldiers have had little compact motorbikes. They did this with little, lawnmower engined mini bikes way back when also. But
well, I think this one, kind of reminds me a little bit more of the story that we talked about on High Side, Low Side Live, where was it? Dubai? They were putting the zeros on the helicopters and they were trying to figure out how to use electric motorcycles for that. These bikes do seem a little bit more off-road mountain bike-esque. I don't think I personally I don't care if these bikes take off for military applications, but they did look like they would be fun to ride. And again, I think this is where we're starting to see the focus of electric vehicles is not so much long distance touring the way we sometimes think about motorcycles in America, but very specific applications, especially as we look at dirt bikes or track bikes or things like that. And that takes us right into the second story involving electric bikes is the Stark Varg electric bike announcement. Now, just for those of you listening, Varg means strong wolf in English for the translation there.
You mean in English? In Swedish?
Well, if you translate Varg to English, the translation roughly or loosely is strong wolf.
You mean the word Varg in Swedish? Like the translation from Swedish?
Yes, translated into
Just to be clear
English.
that the word Varg in English does not mean strong wolf.
No, in Varg, it simply means Varg.
It means Varg. Okay, cool.
Nothing.
Just making sure.
Yeah. But if we translate it, strong wolf.
So for those watching or listening on YouTube, hopefully we can throw up a picture of that little sucker you can check out. It kind of looks like if Tony Stark designed a motocross bike. It's very swoopy and futuristic. But
what's the claimed torque? Tell us the claimed torque.
I don't actually know. You know. What is it? Oh,
you don't know?
It's no, I don't remember.
691 foot-pounds of claimed torque, according to that article.
I don't know what they're talking about.
691 foot-pounds of claimed torque.
What does that even mean?
Insane.
That has to be that's a typo.
That's got to be a typo. Like,
there's no way.
It's so just so we're clear.
I don't even know why we're talking about that. Stop talking about that. That's not real.
It's the same size as like a CRF 450. Makes 80 horsepower. Like they're claiming 80 horsepower, which is like 20 horsepower more than a traditional 450 would make. It's all kinds of it's like carbon fiber sleeved engine. The engine case is an air-cooled magnesium engine. The motor's a magnesium engine cases or motor cases. But if that's not a typo and they're claiming 691 foot-pounds of torque, it's bananas.
I don't think I think it's kind of like whatever. I don't want to talk about it anymore. The point is, it's a sort of a modern iteration of like what the Alta was. It looks the teaser video they put out is pretty cool. It looks very capable and interesting. I guess my concern is what happened to Alta. Like Alta had a good badass electric motocross bike and dual sport bike. Those were cool, and they even had a supermoto. It was actually good to use, good to ride. It was fun.
What happened to them? Don't act like you don't know what happened to them.
Well, I'm just saying, what's to keep Stark, or perhaps Varg, whatever. Stark, I think, is the name of the company.
Stark
right?
is the company, yeah.
What's to keep them from having the same problem?
Well, so for everyone out there listening, if you don't know, Alta was bought by Harley Davidson. Harley Davidson then shuttered the doors. What I will say is that there's a couple little things here. Starting MSRP is around $12,000. They're already taking pre-orders on this. Zach and I, one of our but see, that's one of our biggest complaints is that we want to actually see this in person. What I thought was interesting too is that it comes with a smartphone. So for that money, it comes with a smartphone that you can actually insert your SIM card in and use it as a phone, or you can actually use your current Android or iOS device on it as the dash. So it seems like Stark is a technology company first that's moving into the world of motorcycling. Maybe I'm wrong with that, but it seems like a very sophisticated look forward as to what we might be able to expect from motorcycles in general regarding smartphones as dashes.
Well, let's hope it comes to be and is totally awesome and everything's great.
I mean, 691 foot-pounds of torque.
All right. Okay, so that
actually...
On the topic of technology on dirt bikes, we wanted to talk over really quickly that KTM announced putting a quick shifter on its 2022 450, which is kind of interesting and pertinent to. We've talked about this for a while. I don't know if Spurgeon, if you and I have had, but Ari and Spencer and I have had this conversation many times about why aren't quick shifters on dirt bikes? Because anytime you use a quick shifter on a street bike, you're like, man, this is neat. Like, I don't need it. It doesn't, it's not getting me to the grocery store any faster, but it's really cool technology. And it feels awesome to be able to be wide open on the throttle and just lift up on the shifter and have it pop into gear, or push down on the shifter if you're a GP shift. Point being, it's cool technology, and it's oddly never been on dirt bikes. As far as I know, even on supercross bikes where they do like a gated start and are all trying to get a hole shot, like, why wouldn't they have quick shifters?
Well, it seems like they're going to try this technology out. I'm kind of torn on this. One, I personally am not a huge fan of quick shifters in general outside of track riding, street track riding. I think off-road, the problem that I have is that when you engage the quick shifter, it does change the way the shift feels. It feels a little bit more vague. In my personal opinion, it doesn't feel like as solid of a shift, at least in some of the experience that I've used the quick shifter on an adventure bike where you can turn it on or turn it off. But one of the biggest complaints that I hear from new riders that are starting to learn how to ride off-road is when they're standing up and they go to try and use the clutch and to shift at the same time.
Right.
It's a hard skill to master if you've never ridden off-road before, you've never stood up. So I think, now, you're not buying a KTM 450 as a beginner bike, so that argument goes right out the window.
Hopefully not.
But I think if there's some trickle down with this, the quick shifter might make it a little bit easier, one, from a racing standpoint to make up a few seconds in a race. Yep. But then two, from a stability standpoint for new riders, I think this is one of the reasons that electric dirt bikes in general have a lot of appeal, because there is no shifting. You just go out there and you ride it without having to worry about what you're doing with your feet while you're standing up.
Yeah, fair enough.
But easily a cool, innovative piece from KTM, and it'll be interesting to see how this technology starts to trickle down.
Yeah. Well, off the topic of dirt bikes, we wanted to pass along the news to everyone, just in case you hadn't heard that Earl Hayden passed away, and there was a real groundswell of support for the Hayden family. If you're not familiar with Earl Hayden, he was the father of Roger Hayden, Nikki Hayden, Tommy Hayden, as well
as Jenny and Kathleen. There were two daughters there too.
Correct. Less prominent in the motorcycling community, but still good human beings as far as I can tell. Anyway, a bit of a racing dynasty in the United States, and Earl was a personality that was well known around the world because Nikki ended up being such a prominent racer in MotoGP and World Superbike, and so the global press for motorcycle racing was familiar with Earl and his sort of his personality and his idiosyncrasies, and so it was a sad day for racing to see someone like that who's such a prominent sort of almost regal figure in motorcycle road racing to pass away.
And everything that I've ever read about him too, he was a family man. He spent a lot of time, working with his kids and developing his kids. And frankly, I wish that my parents would have built me a flat dirt track in my backyard too. But my parents weren't nearly as kind. So,
well, yeah, he's left big shoes to fill for motorcycling parents, I think.
But wrapping this up as far as building tracks and racing in general.
Nice segue.
Thank you very much. Laguna Seca is getting repaved, and this may lead to some mixed results from riders, from racers. Obviously, earlier this year, Circuit of the Americas was in the news after MotoGP riders were having some real struggles getting through some of the bumpy corners, but it sounds like Laguna Seca is trying to get ahead of some of the issues that they might be having. And Zach, I know you had some thoughts on this based on some experiences that I believe you were at least familiar with the last time that Laguna Seca was repaved.
Oh, geez. Those MotoGP racers, they're such pansies. Oh, it's too bumpy. Just kidding. Riding those bikes at all must be must be kind of scary. And I mean, at Laguna Seca especially, which is a pretty small track for bikes like that. But yes, I do recall a number of years ago they repaved, Laguna was repaved sort of when MotoGP doesn't go to Laguna Seca currently, but when it did, they repaved the circuit just before MotoGP arrived to sort of smooth it out. And there's a world-class, World Championship Series coming here. We gotta fix it up. And it went pear-shaped. The pavement started peeling up and coming apart, and it was a bad scene. So hopefully this time around it's more better. I'm not sure how it'll shake out exactly, but the point here, I think, is that it's encouraging that money is being invested in some place like Laguna Seca, which of course is an iconic and famous, maybe the most famous racetrack in the United States.
And I would say, too, if you want to see exactly what Zach and I are talking about in regards to some of the complaints around Circuit of the Americas, there was an article on Common Tread back in September when the race was run, and there was some really great video clips where you could actually see the bikes like bouncing off the ground mid-corner. I think Ari Henning actually dropped in a photo of his own personal experience in the comments section where you could actually see his rear tire, 2 inches off the ground. But really, it is an issue, especially when you're looking at those kind of speeds and what those riders are doing and the risk that they're putting, themselves in the way of. So definitely you can go back and check out that article if you want to see some more videos. But that pretty much is going to wrap up what we have in the news.
Right. So let's get Spenser Robert in here and start talking about what makes bikes good looking and what makes them bad looking.
Well, speaking of good looking, Spenser Robert, ladies and gentlemen, look at him. Easy on the eyes. Easy on the eyes.
It's like I'm looking in a mirror. Just two other brunette bearded white dudes. How's it going? What a beautiful display of variety we are.
Yeah,
Oh my
seriously.
God.
What more could the internet want than the opinions of these three people?
Oh, well, with a start like that, holy hell. All right, so
So we're talking about best and worst looking motorcycles of all time. We've come to the table with some selections, which again we have not shared with each other. So we're going in blind here to a certain extent. Hopefully, we'll have fun chewing this over. We do have some other topics with regard to the motorcycle looks later in the discussion, but pretty sure we agreed to start with. Best and worst motorcycles that we've owned. Is that right?
And this is not, just to be very clear, this is not best and worst performance of any kind. This is simply looks subjectively, how pretty are they? We're not talking about performance at all.
Correct.
Awesome.
I feel like you're really planting a seed for some reason. But
Exactly.
I can't wait to find out.
Just saying.
It's a rolling chassis with no engine.
It's that bike right behind him. Yeah, look at
exactly.
it.
That actually is that is one of the bikes that is. I don't want to give it away, but yeah.
Beautiful in its simplicity.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, so guest honors. Let's start with best looking motorcycle you have ever owned, Spenser Robert.
Oh, goodness. I wish that this was more difficult, but the truth is I think I've only ever owned one motorcycle that could even vaguely qualify as being kind of okay looking. And
Honda Shadow 500.
No,
Yeah.
hey, spoilers.
Yeah.
No, we'll get to that in a second. I owned a 76 CB550.
Yeah.
So, just kind of classic UJM, just, single round headlight, flat seat. It's a beautiful bike. It's very cafe racer. Nothing about it was groundbreaking other than it was just sort of, the CB550 that is. It just kind of lived in the shadow of the CB750, but I liked it because it was a little bit smaller. It was sort of my my first adult motorcycle after having SV650 when I was younger and riding dirt bikes and whatnot. And I was like, no, I'm just going to buy this for the style,
So
Nice.
I want to see if our editors can put a picture up of my 76 CB550 next to yours, because mine could be a contender for one of my ugliest bikes that I've ever owned. So I'm guessing the condition that mine was in is not in the condition yours in. So can you describe for the audience a little bit, Spenser? Was it in stock condition? Can you with the 550? Did it have the 4x4 pipes, or did you have a modified
4x4, baby? Yeah,
Okay.
That's a good look.
Yeah, I was cool because that inline 4 was sort of revolutionary in the motorcycling world, and I like that they showed it off by having the 4x4. They're like, you want to see two mufflers on either side, just so people are like, that's twice as many mufflers as I'm used to looking at.
Look at how many mufflers.
Look at all my mufflers. I'm muffler rich. But yeah, it was. I think the bike. For most people, they would just look at it and be like, "Oh, that's a cafe racer." It kind of just it took a lot of, I think, styling cues from those British racing bikes in the 50s, it was in pretty good condition. It had Clubman bars, so the bars were a little bit lower than stock. And one of the downsides of the CB550 and the 750, if I recall, is that they had massive blocky turn signals, and this had aftermarket turn signals. So it was a little bit modified. I didn't actually do any of that. It was just the way I bought it. But yeah, I think it's the only motorcycle I've ever bought basically entirely because of looks. It wasn't a practical bike. It wasn't, it didn't handle particularly well or anything. I was just in my early 20s and was like, yeah, I just want a bike that's cool. I just want it to look awesome because I've never really had a bike that did that. So
what color?
It was sort of like a reddish root beer. The tank was two-tone, so it had kind of, if I recall, it was sort of black in the middle of the tank and then sort of a root beer on the top and the sides. So yeah, it was sort of a classic CB550 look. I'm
That's
very curious
awesome.
about yours now.
Mine was Rhino Liner. The guy that I bought it from had used like a Rhino Liner black. It was textured and it was a real to scrape off of there. And then once
that was the color of the bike, like it was the tank was covered in Rhino Liner.
Yes, it was a $500 motorcycle that I pulled out of a garage, and then I ended up just stripping the Rhino Liner off of it, riding it around for a little while with it just a bare tank, and then finally I was just like, I'm not going to get around to restoring this, so I sold it a couple of years back or a year back, and yeah, so I bought it with grand intentions of like not having it be a rat bike and like actually getting it back to its glory. I think one of my favorite colors from that era for that bike was the orange. It was like that burnt orange that Honda had in the 70s.
Very
Yeah.
Mustard.
So so mine was definitely more of a rat bike. Yours sounds like it was much more of an original condition. But
Yeah.
mine did have the 4x4 exhaust, and when I was thinking about when I was putting it together to sell, if you wanted to, you can actually part them out for a lot more than you can just sell them for as a complete bike, because that 4x4 exhaust, I held up two fingers, but I meant to hold up two on each side. Is actually quite rare because a lot of them rusted out at the bottom and a lot of them didn't hold up too well.
Yeah, well, I know we got a lot of bikes to talk about here.
Yeah, we do.
So hit me. What do you guys have?
Zach, what do you got?
Well, it's hard to say. I think my pick for the ugliest motorcycle I've ever owned
Well,
is...
we're doing prettiest.
Or we're doing prettiest. Sorry, that's right.
Is it the same
Don't
bike?
jump ahead. Yeah.
It's basically the same bike, yeah. Prettiest bike I've ever owned. I'm gonna go with. So I did own a KTM 450 EXC, but it's not like beautiful. It just like looks good because it's a dirt bike. Like dirt bikes look cool, and that they all look the same. That doesn't count. So I'm gonna go with the Grand Prix bike that I raced when I was a teenager, 1996 Honda RS 125, and it's just a real pretty looking bike. I think it's very simple. You know, it's just really narrow and small and slippery looking. I'm
going to pull it up because I'm not super familiar. Whoa, wow. So it's very race bikey.
So
very
is this-
racy, very racy.
So
I mean, you know,
yours was just white. You didn't have stickers or decals or
no.
racing
Well, I mean, I had like
sponsors?
numbers on it, and like eventually there were some like stickers on the side. Like sometimes you go to races and they say like this series is sponsored by, you know, like EBC brake pads, so you have to put an EBC sticker on there. So like it had stuff like that on it, but basically it was just white, just like that. Yeah, I don't know. I've always just sort of, you know, it does speak to the purpose a little bit, which to Spurgeon's point, it's not about performance or anything like that. But I feel like there's something to be said, as we'll talk about later, I'm sure. There's sort of beauty and purpose, you know, like it looks purposeful. It looks like it's supposed to do a thing and cut through the air. And I always thought that it was a handsome iteration of a bike like that.
Well, I think that gets into. I think that from a styling perspective, there is a little bit of a bleed over of like why, from a purpose standpoint, why a bike looks a certain way, and I think
Right.
that does add to a certain appeal to the aesthetic. I think it's interesting that you had, one of your other contenders was your KTM, because we had done some honorable mentions from our other hosts here, and Brandon picked
Right.
a KTM 250 XCF, which is just a brand new 250 XCF off the shelf that he happens to own, and he's just like, yeah, this is just this is the best looking bike that I own. Brandon also owns a really cool looking Triumph Thruxton, which I probably, if you asked me which of Brandon's bikes are the better looking ones, I probably would have gone with that one. But Brandon feels that his 250 dirt bike is the prettiest bike that he owns. So
I don't feel like he tried very hard. I think someone sent him an email saying,
Seriously.
"Hey, Brandon, what's the prettiest bike?" And he just went, "I guess that one, like the one that I can see right now when I'm responding."
No, to be fair, Brandon did not respond. I'm sorry to throw Brandon under the bus here. He did not respond that was the best looking bike that he owns. That was the best looking bike of all
ever.
time.
Yeah.
Which I think is like a
Yeah.
little, maybe
That's
because
sweet.
he just spent money on it and he was like, nothing is better looking than the thing that I just bought.
It has to be. It must be the best looking motorcycle. Otherwise, yeah.
Ever.
To-
Yeah.
in Brandon's defense, like I said, I do think dirt bikes inherently look kind of cool. They look like tall, and they do have that kind of purposeful look in a way. But they're so homogenous. It's just it's hard to be excited about any one in particular. Anyway, Spurge, you're up. Best looking bike you've ever owned.
Bike I've ever owned.
I think I know what it's going to be. I haven't even looked yet. I'm going to look.
Take it. Let me know if you're right. Is it correct?
No.
Did you?
I'm guessing a VFR. Is it a VFR?
It's a VFR. So easily the best looking bike that I've ever owned. Like I said, I've owned I've owned a CB550, but mine was not nearly as pretty as Spenser's. Mine was a 1999 Honda VFR 800. The bike had like 55,000 miles on it when I bought it, but it was in immaculate condition. I was working at a shop down in Nashville. The original owner brought it in to trade it in on something else. So I bought it off the original owner, and it was an older gentleman who, I mean, it was meticulously
like
maintained.
Most VFR owners, it was an older gentleman.
Yeah, but that to this day, that's still, and it'll get into some of the best looking bikes of all time as we get further into this podcast episode. But the classic lines, the looks, the fairing, the single-sided swing arm, everything about it was just appealing. The tank, the gauge layout, like, I don't know. It was just one of those bikes that, like, I mean, to this day, I can't say I regret selling it because the money went to another motorcycle that I got a lot of enjoyment out of. The only thing that I would say would have made that bike prettier is I owned the red one, and I think the yellow one is the ultimate of what could have been in the VFR.
A yellow Honda?
Yeah. Disagree.
Nope. The yellow Honda Superhawk, the yellow Honda VFR. Mwah.
Well, I've grown. My dad always painted his race bikes yellow, and he always said yellow is a fast color, and I don't know why. To be fair, they were not Hondas, but
it's the color that means start slowing down. I don't know.
As opposed to red, the color that means stop.
Or passion, but like yellow doesn't mean passion. Yellow either means start slowing down or you're starting to get sick. And I feel like either way, no offense, Timco, but
yeah. Well, his other race bike color of choice was Battleship Gray, so I don't really know if that won't kill the conversation. I don't know what will. Spurge, why don't you pick it up with worst looking bike you've ever owned? Is it that CB550?
No, I wish it was, but I wish I could say that's the only bike. So the bike behind me, actually, I'm going to do this. Give me 1 second.
Spurgeon's leaving the podcast now. He's running back to take this rolling chassis, and he's putting it so that we can see it. I can already see it, but that's probably,
I can
not
see
framed quite right.
So
anyway,
for those of you listening, I just rolled this back. So this is actually in a lot better looking condition than when I bought it.
It's a project. That's why.
Yeah, exactly. But so what I did was I bought for $75 a 1983 Kawasaki 440 LTD. Now, for those of you listening that are not familiar with what a 1982, 83 Kawasaki 440 LTD looks like, it's like a little mini cruiser, belt drive, parallel twin. There were some 440s that looked kind of cool. This was not that. It had like the step seat and like the real low, everything was rubber on it. Like the handle grips were like huge and the foot pegs were huge, big rubber chunks. It was just
Also, for everyone watching, that is not what Spurgeon's bike looks like.
Well, not now.
The one in the background is
So
is a frame with wheels and a fork.
It's like you're describing this bike for people that can't see, and you're describing not the bike that's actually behind you.
So when I bought it, it did not look like this. So I cut the rear frame off, and this is all. That's not what it looked like. So I need to find pictures of what it looked like when I pulled it out of this guy's garage. I paid $75 in a case of beer, like cheap beer. Like I think it was like Miller High Life and $75 for this bike. And It was in disgusting condition. And like I said, even if you were looking at this bike brand new on the showroom floor, it wasn't really an attractive looking motorcycle. I think, I don't want to give too much away, but, cruisers in the 80s, I don't think were especially pretty. But this particular one, pulled out of a garage for $75 was not a looker, but like big belt drive, like just the proportions didn't really work on it. So that was literally the ugliest bike that I ever bought.
And Spenser, you can pick up the torch here with the ugliest bike you've ever owned.
Yeah, let's keep the theme going for the ugly 80s cruisers. What? I
didn't think it was going to be the ugliest bike you've ever owned.
Is this the same one that's probably sitting behind you right now?
We have a
Can
theme
you-
going with the ugly motorcycles that are sitting behind us. Also, for those who can't see this, there's a very square headlight staring me in the back of the head, feeling betrayed as I say the ugliest bike I've ever owned is a 1983 Honda Shadow 500, which, I'll be honest, by itself in stock condition, in new condition, it's not particularly offensive. It's not the ugliest motorcycle. Like, I think most people would see it go by and almost wouldn't notice it because it's just sort of unremarkable.
People have seen them go by and they've already forgotten about it.
Exactly. Yeah. I do think it is much uglier than the Ascot, which is the same engine, same platform, but Honda just had two versions of it. This is the cruiser version of the Honda Ascot for those that are familiar.
I would say the Ascot was a kind of a cool bike.
Yeah, agreed. So I think that it makes this bike, it makes the Honda Shadow uglier because it has the Ascot as a sibling. And then this one is particularly heinous just because of its general condition and lack of attention and care that has been given to it. We bought this years and years ago. Technically, I bought it for a video we did called How to Get Into Motorcycling for $1,000. So it was the cheapest motorcycle I could find anywhere in Southern California running. Yeah. And there have been many discussions about using it for something, everything from like, oh, if we need a bike to push off a cliff, then we'll at least have the Honda Shadow around. But it's not offensive. It's just definitely not an attractive bike.
I do want to note that Spenser is, if you're listening to this, Spenser is sitting in our West Coast studio. I am in our East Coast studio. So Spenser and I are both using RevZilla to basically house our ugly motorcycles that we don't want to leave in our own garages at home.
Don't get Zach started on this.
That's a good segue, though, for perhaps the ugliest bike I've ever owned, which is in the garage building that I am sitting in right now. So I'm also close to this machine. Hopefully it can't hear me. But I own, as people may or may not know at this point, a 2006 KTM 950 Supermoto, which I have never thought was particularly good looking. And I still don't think it's particularly good looking.
I don't think no one's ever accused, even people that love that bike, no one's ever accused of being good looking, I don't think.
Exactly.
I disagree. I think it's got some personality to it.
No, it's like a weird mashup of dirt bike and street bike, and like the small wheels and the dirt bike seat and this weird like hexagonal headlight, and it's
Spurgeon.
I don't know.
Spurgeon, saying that something has a good personality is like literally the go-to code for it's not very good looking.
I think it has like a unique style that you could appreciate it for its uniqueness.
Oh boy, I feel like we know where this is going. Spurgeon, the KTM lover, is defending even my motorcycle. No, I think it is just kind of an awkward. It's like tall and gangly, and like I said, it combines sort of dirt bike style and street bike style in a way that is not particularly flattering, I don't think. And it's a big bike, like 1,000cc or 942cc V twin, so it's a pretty big engine and a pretty big bike in general. So it doesn't have the kind of like lithe scalpel look of like a small supermoto. I don't know. It's not very good looking, but boy, do I love it. What a terrific motorcycle.
It is lovely to ride. I feel like that's its. I like that. This question was, what's the ugliest bike you've ever owned? And we all still currently own the ugliest bike we've ever owned. That's I don't know what that says.
We can't find anybody to buy them because they're hideous.
I don't want to sell mine, just to be clear. But it is funny to come around to that.
I'd like to go the opposite route. I do want to sell mine. So if anybody out there wants an 83 440 LTD in questionable condition, the rest of the parts are at home in my garage. So you just give me a call.
Whatever Spurgeon will sell his bike for, I will sell mine for $100 less, and it has an engine in it. So I'm just putting that out there.
Oh lordy.
So let's get it. We're having fun already, but boy, are we wasting a lot of time. Let's get to the meat of this is the sort of meat of the podcast right here. The best looking motorcycle that has ever been produced. And I want to say, before we start talking about best motorcycle ever produced and ugliest motorcycle ever produced, I feel
looking,
like,
not best ever produced. Sorry. Yes, looking.
Best looking. Correct. Thank you for the correction.
You're welcome.
I don't think we talked about this beforehand. I'm less interested in one-off custom builds. I'm just putting that out there before anyone says anything. I'm less interested in
I
that.
didn't pick a one-off custom
production,
build.
best looking production
bikes.
motorcycle.
And there's a sliding scale of production, right? Like some bikes were produced on great scale, some bikes were produced in small scale. But the point is, the idea that like, oh, well, this one guy in Oregon built, a whatever CB550 into a, this beautiful custom bike that's all chrome and whatever. Like, that's cool. Those are beautiful bikes. But I think in general, it sounds like we're all agreed. We're talking about motorcycles that have been produced en masse.
I'm going to throw two quick caveats out to that. One, for best looking, absolutely. Worst looking, mine might be sliding a little bit to the scale of like not quite a one-off, but like not quite a production. So
we'll have some variety.
Yeah, and then the other point here is that the rules that we kind of talked about were for us to pick just one of what we thought was the best looking bike of all time. I know that I didn't adhere to those rules. I have a couple of bikes that I like. I don't think Zach adhered to. I think Spenser is probably the only one that played by the rules.
Here's the thing. I think we can mention other bikes.
We can.
Okay.
But I think you have to say, this is my pick. And I agree. It was very difficult. I thought it was going to be easy when we talked about this topic. I'm like, oh yeah, I already have a couple that come to mind. But then when I really sat down and you have to say, this is the ugliest, it's challenging.
And a podcast will live forever. So here we go, Spenser Robert. What's your pick for the best looking motorcycle of all time?
Oh, God. I didn't want to go first on this one.
Well, guest honors. That's the way this goes.
Well, I apologize. I don't think mine is going to be a very popular pick. But here's the thing. I feel like there are a lot of motorcycles that get a lot of credit frequently for being the best looking motorcycles of all time. And I wanted to try and think outside the box a little bit.
So Honda Shadow 500.
It's a Versus 650. Here's the thing. I'm going to give you a clue.
Okay.
It is Italian. So, not a huge surprise there.
Right.
Designed by an aeronautical engineer. It is a motorcycle that has won many races. The specific one I am going to pick came out in the 1950s. Spurgeon, are you already looking at the picture? I see you looking at a computer.
I'm not. I promise.
Okay.
I'm just sitting here waiting to see. I'm thinking Ducati. Like Ducati's where my head is going because but then you said in the 1950s, and I'm pretty sure Ducati didn't really start producing motorcycles until the 1950s. It was after World War II, right?
Late
40s, early 50s.
Is it a Gilera?
It is not a Gilera. It is.
It's V8.
I think the most beautiful motorcycle ever made, a 1955 Vespa GS150.
Ooh.
A scooter?
Interesting.
Here's the thing. I know.
Scooter.
I recognize it. Listen, I know that it's not going to be popular for that reason, but I can't think of another motorcycle that is as iconic in terms of design, in terms of its beauty. I get that people are like, oh, well, what about the 951, or what about a Vincent Black Shadow? Like, I know that there are lots of motorcycles like that, but Vespa, in terms of global design impact, I don't know that there's another motorcycle that has had a greater impact, especially, the first Vespa was the Vespa 98, which I think came out in 1944. But the GS150 is what we now know the modern Vespa to be. They moved the headlight up to the handlebar. It's purposeful. It is beautiful. It is a design that still looks good today. Now, 60 years later or 70 years later. And
it still looks roughly the same, correct? Like
it does. Granted, that one was a 4-speed 2-stroke, but they've kept the lines the same because if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And it's just it is the sort of design that has transcended motorcycling. People have it on T-shirts even if they don't ride. There are movies about it. There are songs about it. I think it's one of those designs that will be around until the end of motorcycling. Even when they make electric Vespas, and they've already started to, they're still going to look like that because they nailed it.
So I wasn't expecting that. Genuinely, I wasn't expecting that. But it makes sense, because if you think about, when people started talking about cafe racers, right? There was the rockers and the mods, and I think there was this whole culture around scooters and accessorizing scooters, and they had their own little subculture that I think sometimes we as motorcyclists tend to forget or overlook. We'll talk about cafe racers or the modifications that were made to British bikes of that era, But I would agree with you in the fact that I think that a lot of us tend to just, block out what the scooter culture was doing at that time.
Yeah, and it has legitimate design shops. The guy that designed it, Corradino Discagno, was an aeronautical engineer.
Did you know that off the top of your head, or did you do that in research?
Get out of here.
Oh no, I didn't know this. I wasn't born knowing that it was Corradino Discagno. But it is, yeah. In the research, because I was trying to figure out what bike do I want to do, and there are many iconic motorcycle designers. But I liked that I had never heard of him before I started researching the Vespa. And one of the reasons I hadn't heard of him is that he hates being associated with the Vespa because he designed Italy's first helicopter. He was this he designed fighter planes during World War II. He has these amazing engineering achievements, and basically everybody in Italy knows him as the Vespa guy, and I think that's always sort of been something he was disappointed in. But the point is, he had real design and engineering chops, and he applied that to, in his perception, fix the motorcycle. He didn't like that you had to swing a leg over a seat in order to ride a bike. He didn't like that women wearing dresses couldn't easily ride motorcycles. He didn't like that your legs got dirty because they were out in the open. So he basically solved all of that with the first Vespa 98, and he continued to design the Vespas for another 10 or 15 years after the first one. So it is purposeful and beautiful.
You're teetering on function a little bit, trying keeping your pant legs clean, but I appreciate the swoopy lines, and you just talk about the global impact of the image of the Vespa. It's sort of it's the quintessential motor scooter. Is sort of people use it almost as a way to describe scooters. They'll just say my friend got a Vespa, even though if it's a Yamaha Vino or a Honda Metropolitan, people that they're just they got a Vespa. I don't know. It's a little.
Yeah, and everybody else copied the design. The
totally.
Yamaha Vino is designed to look like a Vespa, but
it's a little too dump trucky for me, though. I gotta say, it's a little too utilitarian.
I don't agree with
trucky.
that. It's not dump trucky. I mean, look at those lines. It is a pretty looking machine. I mean, I don't agree with that one.
What about the? I just mean from a utility standpoint, the big scoop out in the middle and the big,
but it
the
looks
step
cool.
through aspect.
It all flows together.
It flows. It flows. Yes.
I was a scooter guy before either one of you, so you don't come at me about telling me about scooters. But I'm still not sold on that. What about the? Do you remember the Vespa? Was it the 948 or the Vespa 9? Do you remember? It came out a few years ago, and it's an ultra retro single seat Vespa. We'll figure out what the actual name was, and we'll put it up on screen for those of you on YouTube. But it was a very, very swoopy retro design that they came out with, and it tried to kind of capture all of the sexiest things about the Vespa design and sort of reimagine them. And I feel that, I don't know, that almost because it's sort of reaching. It has a futuristic look to it. I almost think it is better looking just because it's taken all the best. It's not the original one. I get that, but
yeah. I was just gonna say, I think in general I have a hesitation to point out any sort of current-ish motorcycle as the most beautiful motorcycle, because I think in some ways you need time in order to appreciate the beauty of a motorcycle. Is it still beautiful 10, 20, 30 years after it was originally manufactured? Because a lot of times any new bike looks kind of interesting and cutting edge, and you're just wow, it's going to look awesome forever. And then 10 years later, can you believe that we rode that thing? But in any case, if anyone is still listening after we talked about scooters for 10 minutes, then thank you, and I apologize, and we can move on to another pick.
So, Zach, if you feel that looks as that's a dump truck in your mind, what's your idea of a good-looking motorcycle?
I didn't say it was a dump truck. I said it's dump trucky in so much as it's very utilitarian. It's got a little bed where you put your feet and your legs.
Dump trucky.
It's hard.
We're making up adjectives.
We are. Well, my pick is much more mainstream, so we'll bring it back towards center here. No one's going to be surprised about the bike that I picked. But
did you have one pick, or did you have some that you were contenders?
No. I have lots of other stuff I can talk about. Believe me, I could go all day. I could run the power grid out of juice talking about which motorcycles are the best looking. But I'm going to go with the Britain V1000. And I think that it is.
Is that a product? You want to count that as a production?
You just gave a
spiel.
I know. But look, the guy died of cancer.
You can't change the rules though.
No, to be fair, it was not produced en masse. It was not produced by the thousands. They only made 10 of them or something like that. I think they eventually made more than that, but the original run was only something like 10 of them. But I think one of the reasons that it, in my mind, stands up as a production bike is that it was made to be, the guy John Britton produced it in the best of his ability. It wasn't like he made one and said like, this is the bike, and then that was the end of it. He made engine castings, and he designed a way to make wheels, and he came up with design concepts, and he produced it as much as he could. So you can call me on that if you want. You can say like that doesn't count. There weren't enough of them. But I think
did they make 5 in total?
I thought it was 10.
Yeah, I think it's 10, 9 or 10. I mean,
Okay.
I think in the original, I'm not sure. I think they may have made more after, with using the design. But at any point, I mean, at any rate, there aren't very many, certainly, that exist. But yeah, I just feel like it's, to your point about it being good looking still, I still think it sort of looks futuristic and state of the art, even though it was made in the mid 90s. And it's a weird looking bike. It's very kind of swoopy and looks like it was designed in a wind tunnel.
Can you kind of describe it for the audience?
I'm trying to, if you would just, give me a minute.
But do a better job of it. Like, use colors.
So we're getting to that. It has a weird kind of girder fork in the front. Like, it doesn't have a typical front end, which is kind of funny looking, and it hides behind a little bit of a fairing. And the two colors that he chose to use for some reason are like this bright sky blue and then pink. So some of the panels are pink and some of them are blue, which is really striking. But it sort of looks like it's going fast, even though it's sitting still, and it's also very interesting to look at. It doesn't have, like I said, the front end is a little bit atypical, and then the rear shock is mounted on the front of the engine or underneath the engine. I think it's in front of the engine. It's very strange to look at, and it sort of encapsulates a lot of design that is a little bit odd. And yet I think the thing that speaks to its beauty the most is that it came out in 92 or 94 or sometime in the 90s, I think. And I think even today, if you look at it, it almost looks modern. It almost looks, cutting edge or futuristic.
What
really
engine?
cool looking.
What engine is this using? Because he didn't build the engine, right? He used a Honda engine.
No, he built the engine. The engine.
Did
he cast the engine like in his kitchen. It's an unbelievable story. Also, I should say. He built I think it's a 60-degree V twin. I should know that off the top of my head, but I don't. But anyway, it's a liquid cooled V twin, 1000cc V twin that produced a lot more horsepower than it probably should have. The guy made everything. He made the wheels, he made the engine, he made the frame, he designed with chicken wire the whole fairing. He built all the aerodynamics. It's a fabulous story of engineering. It's incredible. But I think that the coolest thing about it, like I said, as far as the way that it looks, is that it still looks cool, even though it was designed so long ago.
Well, I think what's interesting is I just learned something new, because forever I thought that the power plant was Honda. I thought he built it around Honda's V twin at the time, but I guess I was wrong on that.
I think the Britain brings up something I struggled with when I started to think about what's the most beautiful motorcycle ever made, because to me, I think the Britain is amazing. And every time I look at it, I'm just sort of awestruck by the fact that this guy, as you said, Zach, he basically built this motorcycle at his house.
Yeah.
But when I look at the Britain, I find it more striking than beautiful. And I feel like there's kind of a subtle distinction there that there are a lot of motorcycles that I personally find very striking. Like, I see it and it sort of, it stops me in my tracks. It sort of takes my breath away. But I don't necessarily think of it as beautiful. It strikes me because, as you said, it is so different. I mean, the exhaust of the Britain is like, it looks like these like entrails, and as you said, the colors are really unusual. It's not a combination you typically see in motorcycling.
I mean, the headers are actually colored, right? It's like a powder coated blue for the engine headers.
Yeah.
So I mean, I have a lot of love and respect for the bike. I don't think it is the most beautiful bike ever made, but I do think it is one of the most striking motorcycles ever made, and I think it's a huge achievement.
Well, you're talking to the guy who bought a KTM 950 Supermoto and was like, "Yep, I'm okay being seen on this." So it's possible that I'm drawn more to striking than I am to sort of outright beauty. And I also feel like it's a slippery slope for reaching for what's beautiful. Like if you think it's something is swoopy and really beautiful, then you can sort of just find the swoopiest bike you could possibly find. Or if you think like the aerodynamics or fairing is really pretty, then like what bike has the biggest and most slipperiest?
I disagree with that because I think, and maybe we'll talk about this in ugliest bikes ever, but I think if you say, for example, I love swoopy bikes, and let me just find the swoopiest bike ever, that you can go way too far.
Agreed.
Way too far.
So I think it's all about where is the balance, right? Like what machine and design strikes the balance of function and beauty and whatever aesthetic you happen to like. So
and
it's obviously subjective.
The balance, you talk about balance, but then is it then generic? Because it's not one thing or another, and it's kind of in the middle. It's too balanced. But that speaks to your pick also. You picked the Vespa, which in some ways, is certainly beautiful, and in other ways is generic because it's the thing that everyone's copied at this point. So it's not as striking because it's just what people expect when they look at a scooter, kind of, So it's 6 1/2 dozen the other, I suppose.
I just want to say that Ari Henning did agree with you. So Ari's pick for this one was a Britain V1000 as well. I just want to jump in with the Britain and say I respect the Britain more from the engineering aspect of it than I do the overall looks. I think that it's got a very unique aesthetic to it, but it's not a bike that I would have picked as, best looking bike of all time. I think most impressive feat of engineering, the fact that it was built by a guy in his kitchen, all of that, really cool. But from the looks perspective, I'm gonna just kind of keep myself silent on that conversation.
Interesting. Yeah.
So what do you got?
It's like
Spurgeon. So what? I feel like. Now I'm interested. I mean, I agree with you ultimately, but you're like, that doesn't do it for me. I don't feel like you're on board with the scooter necessarily, so let's round it out.
I'm probably a little bit more classic in my aesthetic. So I have 3 picks that I narrowed mine down to, each from a different era.
Each from a different era.
Well,
goodness gracious.
This kind of, it depends on what you define as an era, Zach. We've already been down this road with you. Defining an era with Mr. Cords is pretty hard. So one of the bikes, and I'm going to go in order from third, second to third. Third, second, first.
No. Stop.
I'm making up my own rules.
Nope, you're not. I'm canceling it. You're not making up your own rules. Pick your best looking bike of all time. Full stop. Period. No,
I'm not doing that. I'm not going to do it.
Well, you said you're going to go down the list from 3 to 2 to 1. So pick 3, 2, 1.
Yep. Well, we're going to start with the RC30, which you just rode. Then the other one that was on my list was the 78 Ducati Supersport 750-900. But the one that I picked, the one that I ultimately went with, the one that spoke to me the most was the Triumph TR6 Desert Sled, the 1960-ish just TR6 Desert Sled. In my opinion, it encompasses everything that I originally felt myself drawn to as a motorcyclist. That was a bike that before I was ever a motorcyclist, I saw pictures of that and it was like, well, that's what my idea of motorcycling is. I think a lot of times, we catch flack from our audience members for, not looking at cruisers the same way that some people look at cruisers. And it's purely an aesthetic purpose. Like for me, what I look at and think of as a traditional motorcyclist really is that era of 60s British bikes. That's what brought me into this. And I think the epitome of that is the TR6.
Huh? I mean, I don't know if you have much to say about that, Spencer, but I will say a couple of bikes that I rolled over in my head were like BMW R69S or what was the other one? I don't remember. But basically, this sort of like 60s, 50s or 60s style motor that's very classic and there just isn't a lot of body fat on there. There's a sort of a lovely rounded shaped gas tank and then a fairly flat seat or even a solo, tractor style solo saddle and then suspension and an engine and some pipes. And that's it. Like you don't get much else. It's just what you're looking at is what you get. And there's not a lot of complication to it. And I do appreciate that aspect of it. And it sounds like that's sort of what you're getting at, right? It's like it represents a purity in motorcycling and a simplicity that you appreciate.
Well, there used to be a joke between Lemmy and I, and we were at one specific event, and his buddy Hutch was with us, and his buddy Hutch was on a mid-40s Harley knucklehead. And I remember we were talking about, how I felt about, the look of certain cruisers. And I was like, well, that's a bike that I really like. Like, that's a cruiser that I would ride around every day. And he's like, yeah, that's like a really expensive vintage Harley Davidson. Like, you have caviar taste. And I'm like, well, to me, like, that's more of that purity of aesthetic that I really did appreciate. And I think when you look at what cruisers became, or what, large touring bikes became, they all became overweight. They became too much. It got crowded with all the chrome and the fancy and the bling that wasn't necessarily there in some of these earlier designs.
The chrome and the fancy and the bling.
Exactly.
Spurgeon, one thing I'm curious about, and I honestly don't know Triumph design history well enough to necessarily understand this, but this bike, I'm guessing, came after like the first Bonneville.
I believe the first Bonneville was in the 50s.
Well, no reason. So, like, why the Scrambler over the Bonneville? And I think it's a beautiful bike, but it is resting on the back design-wise of a bike that Triumph is arguably even better known for, and B, you have history with Bonnies, and I understand you like those bikes. So why did you land on the Scrambler?
Because I think this is really, to me, it's even more stripped down in its simple lines. The TR6 was the single carburetor into the still parallel twin engine, but everything was simpler about it. It was a little bit more purpose built, and I try to kind of leave my opinion of what the intended use was for out of it, but it wasn't, again, as cluttered as I think the Bonneville was, especially when you were looking at those early 50s Bonnevilles. There was just a simplicity in this, and even as I am a later, not an original version Bonneville, but a later 2005 Bonneville owner, I liked stripping some of that off of it. I liked taking the big fenders off and kind of simplifying the design of my own bike back to something that was a little bit more svelte in nature. And I think when you looked at the TR6 just came from the factory that way. It was a little bit more of an aggressive looking machine, and I think part of that is what Zach talked about earlier with the dirt bikes. I think there's a certain aesthetic and appeal to a dirt bike, that you can look at and think like, that this is going to be able to do something. It's a bit more aggressive in the way it looks. And I think the TR6 was kind of that line between aggression of purpose-built machinery and still really pretty lines. You don't look at a TR6 and think, oh, that's a dirt bike. It looks like all the other dirt bikes out there. It's something that was definitely, it possessed a beauty all its own.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that it's interesting that we have, that we picked the most iconic scooter of all time, and then a very simple and pure kind of utilitarian motorcycle that could be used on road or off road, and then also an ultra fast, ultra bespoke sport bike as our picks for the most beautiful bikes of all time. I think that goes to show that there's lots of that it's totally subjective, first of all, and that also it doesn't, ultimately what you're reaching for is what speaks to sort of your interest and what you find interesting to look at, and it doesn't necessarily matter, I guess.
So what bikes will everyone be yelling at us for not incling in most
Ducati 916?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ducati 916 or Ducati the MH 900E, the sport classics.
Yep.
Yeah.
What's interesting about this? So first of all, we should say that out of the rest of our hosts, Jen Dunstan, Lance Oliver, and Patrick Garvin all picked a Ducati 916 as their best looking motorcycle of all time. So that was a very well represented motorcycle. The sport classics in Ducati's line, they were all sales flops when they first came out, and then all of a sudden they took off.
The MH 900E, which is a bike that I seriously considered picking for most beautiful of all time. That I found out fascinating history about that. It was I believe, the first motorcycle ever sold directly on the internet. So Ducati on January 1st, 2000, put I think it was 2,000 models up for sale, and they sold 1,000 within the first 30 minutes or 31 minutes, something like that. And they only ended up making that bike for a couple of years. So I don't think that was necessarily a sales flop just because it was so concentrated. But that
was separate from the Sport Classic line.
Exactly. Yeah, that was sort of like the kickoff for the Sport Classics that, as you said, didn't necessarily do all that well.
Yeah, which is interesting because in a lot of communities, the Sport Classics are so kind of like highly regarded, and people have them now, and everyone's like, "Oh man, it's so cool!" It's almost like they
couldn't give them
had
away.
That idea
they couldn't give them away
too soon or something. Yeah, it's strange. So what else? Yeah, so a bunch of Ducatis certainly. I mean, the 916
R32. I mean,
you think?
It's just like it defined BMW design language. Right? I mean, basically to this day, and
so just for everyone's knowledge, Spenser's talking about BMW R32, which I think was it the first BMW motorcycle or the first post twin at least? So it was the flat twin and was black with pinstripes, and it had a lot of stuff going on that has become extremely BMW. But I don't know, it's a little too old. I guess in that realm, I considered like a mid 40s Indian Chief. Like a 1946
Agreed.
Indian Chief with those big fenders, those big like wild fenders. It's like such an elegant bike and yet so rudimentary, you know. I thought that was a really pretty.
You mentioned one in passing earlier, and I think that if we don't really kind of drive it home, but I think the Vincent Black Shadow, Black Lightning, that whole era of 50s motorcycles were, you can't mention it without talking about the Vincent, right? And Raleigh Free and the world speed record and all that, but just the classic muscular look that they had with that engine, and I think that was kind of carried through to a lot of the design aesthetic at the time.
Yeah. Point being, I think there's a 0% chance that anyone listening or watching this is going to be like, oh yeah, let me see, a Vespa, a Britain, and a Triumph Scrambler. Those are the three that I was going to pick. So It doesn't matter what we say, someone's going to have another opinion, and that's obviously the fun part of motorcycling is that it is so subjective. But,
and I would say that we could continue to sit here and go down the rabbit hole of all the pretty bikes, and we haven't even scratched the surface of different eras and other the last 20 years of pretty motorcycles. But before we get into some of the uglier options out there, we need to take a quick break for our sponsor, Motul. Okay, so we are back, and I think it's now time to get into some ugly motorcycles, gentlemen.
Oh man, I maybe more excited about this than the pretty. The picking the most beautiful one is sort of like you feel like you really got to hang your hat on that. But this, you can really spread the hate around if you want to.
And you're so sad with the pretty motorcycles about like, oh, but I forgot about this one, or I didn't have time to say this one. But this is like, just let the hate flow.
We should have actually done this as two separate podcasts. We should have done best looking motorcycles of all time as a podcast, and then worst looking. Like in retrospect, we should probably rethink this if we're ever gonna like do a part 2 of this particular episode.
Yeah, hindsight's 20/20, isn't it?
Really is.
All right, so guest honors yet again. Spenser Robert, what is your pick for the worst looking motorcycle of all time?
There are so many that I would love to talk about, so I'm gonna dive right into the one that I kept coming back to, and that's the BMW K1. I think the first year was 88.
Interesting.
It just I remember the first time I saw that bike. I was probably 10 or 12, and I just I either saw a picture of it in a magazine or I saw a poster of it, and in my very young mind, I was just like, what is that? Not in a good way. Just why does it look like that? Why does it look like Ronald McDonald transformed into a two-wheeled machine? And why do all these body lines not line up with each other? And I just didn't understand what it is. And to this day, I have a much better appreciation, especially doing some research on it. I have a much better appreciation for what they were trying to do. And they apparently there were all these emissions regulations that BMW was trying to get around, and they also had, it sounds like maybe a self-imposed limit of only 100 horsepower. So they're like, all right, there are emissions regulations we're trying to hit, and we can only make a bike with 100 horsepower. How do we make a motorcycle as fast as possible within those limitations? Well, we need to make it with the lowest drag possible. So when it came out, it had the lowest drag coefficient of any production motorcycle. But
very BMW.
Yeah, I think this is a perfect example of utility in a motorcycle is good, but it goes back to that balance we're talking about. This is all utility and no actual good design taste as far as I can tell. They're just like, just make it do the thing, have the lowest drag no matter how ugly it has to be. I don't think they did themselves any favors with the hamburger paint style or the ketchup and mustard.
Can you describe it? Can you describe it for the audience?
Oh my
So
God.
if people
I mean,
don't know what you're talking about?
Yeah, have you seen a hamburger before with ketchup and mustard? It basically looks like that, just add two wheels.
It's all ketchup and all mustard though. There's no bun to save it or to hold it all together.
The defining characteristic is the fact that the fairing and body panels are so big and
huge.
So much.
And that for whatever reason they decided to paint it some pretty outlandish colors, and so there was like the sort of famous one is it's a ketchup and mustard, so it's like a very putrid red and yellow with a little bit of black, and then they also did like a blue and high vis yellow one that was pretty loud. But ultimately, it was a sport touring bike, and BMW was trying to shake the image that they had of like an old man's bike with the the Airhead boxer engines, and so it was really revolutionary for them. They designed this whole new engine, this. Inline 4 that they laid down on its side, and there's a lot of, in typical BMW fashion, very clever engineering that they put into the bike.
Right.
But they went too far, and ultimately, I'm glad that the bike exists because it sort of shook the etch-a-sketch of what a BMW could be. So I'm glad it exists, but I would never, ever, ever actually be proud to own one from a design perspective. I think it's pretty heinous.
So I completely forgot about this bike, and all I can say is I am upset with myself for not having this on my list of ugly motorcycles, because the first time that I saw one of these in person was probably about 10 years ago, and I was at a motorcycle show, and I remember walking in and like you go through like the line of like your classic motorcycles, and then you get to this particular bike, and you're like, what? What and why?
It's like a terrible lab accident.
Yeah, it's not attractive at all. You're absolutely right. This is a great pick, Spencer.
Yeah, I also I read. I've never ridden one. I would love to ride one. If anyone has one, you're probably not going to let me ride it now, but I am an admirer in a way. I read that because of all the bodywork they put on it, it was brutal with heat. Like a lot of the heat had nowhere to escape except on the rider. So especially like under 50 miles an hour, it would just dump heat. And I mean, allegedly riders, this is, motorcycle journalists in the 80s and 90s, so they probably can't be trusted. But they were saying like riders were getting burned from the amount of heat dumping on them. And because of all the bodywork, apparently had an awful turning radius. And it just like functionally so many things were bad about it for this single-minded mission of give it the lowest drag possible so that it can hit 150 miles an hour with 96 horsepower. But yeah.
My hunch is that the heat coming off it and the turning radius aren't actually that bad. In part because bikes have gotten so much more extreme in the modern era. Like I rode that Honda RC30, which was mentioned earlier, Spurgeon of sort of one of the prettiest bikes of all time, and I was able to ride one last year. Write an article, did a daily rider on it if you're interested in what it looks like or what it feels like to ride. But a lot of the articles said first gear is insanely tall. It's so like, I don't know what they were thinking. It's like this racing homologation special, and first gear is so tall. And when I rode it, I was like, this is fine. It works fine. It's not nearly as bad as like a modern Aprilia RSV4 or Yamaha R1 or another modern sort of showroom superbike. So I'm guessing that if the motorcycle journalist who said that the turning radius was bad, jumped to the future and rode a bike now that has a bad turning radius, they'd be like, holy smokes, I had
or a
no
bike
idea.
that made 200 horsepower and actually put heat off, they'd be like,
Exactly.
oh, we were so wrong.
Because the K1 had, how much horsepower? 100 horsepower? 80 horsepower?
I think it was like high 90s from what I saw.
And was it liquid cooled?
Yeah, there was a lot of rad technology. It was liquid cooled. It was it was fuel injected. It was I think it might have been the first production bike with ABS. But the other thing is they had the K100 that was the first flying brick BMW before the K1. And I think the K100 is actually a pretty good bike. or a pretty good looking bike.
So that was actually going to be one of my questions. So this wasn't the BMW that kicked off the K series of bikes, right?
No, it was not.
exactly.
And I also think that the engine, the Flying Brick engine, it's now a pretty popular power plant for custom bike builders. And I think there are some gorgeous Flying Brick custom builds out there. So like the point is the ingredients were there for a good looking motorcycle, but for whatever reason they just dialed it up to 11. And I think it was 88 was the first year of the K1, and they dialed it up to 11 in all the wrong ways.
But I would just say for our audience listening, when we're saying Flying Brick, when we're saying K Series BMW, this was BMW's first real foray into getting away from a boxer twin and getting into a more modern inline four. Is that correct?
Yeah, they're trying to compete with the Japanese basically.
Right, and they're liquid cooled 4-cylinder and 3-cylinder engines that are longitudinally mounted so that there's shaft drive. So they're not transversely mounted like a Japanese 4-cylinder bike where the exhaust is the intake is in the behind and the exhaust is in the front. It's 90 degrees off from that. So the intake is on one side and the exhaust is on the other side, and then the crank ends up pushing or turning a drive shaft instead of a sprocket for a chain. So it's all very it's
wild,
all pretty
yeah.
cattywampus. Yeah, it's very, very wild.
But that being said, I could believe I've never ridden one of these either. But knowing that the exhaust is coming out the side of the engine, I could fathom that this thing would be putting off quite a bit of heat, especially considering I've gotten quite a bit of heat on a modern bike that's better designed. I would have no doubt saying that this is probably putting off a lot of heat towards the rider.
Yeah, maybe. I just think that, like, to Spencer's point, if you ride a bike that is bad with heat management, like a 2012 Yamaha R1 that felt like it was literally going to burn you through your pants from the frame. I mean, that bike was, because it made 165 horsepower or whatever, 180 horsepower, and they didn't give a crap about the rider. So if you rode it for 15 miles an hour in traffic on a hot day, you thought you were going to die. But to Spencer's point, motorcycle journalists exaggerate. And here I am exaggerating. So, all right, Spurge, what do you got for ugliest bike of all time?
Ugliest motorcycle of all time. This was another one that I tried to have a lot of fun with, and I definitely kind of had my little list. But when it came down to it, and this is where like I kind of stretched like production. I think there were like 36 of these made, and Dan Gurney's Alligator ended up being my pick for ugliest bike of all time.
I've never heard of this before. I've got to look it up.
So Dan Gurney's Alligator was a bike that did use a Honda engine. I think it was a 650, but you sat down in it. Like you sat in. I can't even describe it to our audience. Like you have to like look at the screen or Google this on your smartphone. It was hideous, in my opinion.
What is
very
this?
Strange. And so
you've never seen one of these before, Spencer?
I've never seen this. And is that a Honda engine?
It's a Honda engine. So first of all, I would like to say that I am very proud that I've somehow managed to pick a bike that Spencer has never heard of before. That's impressive.
Well, it's an interesting bike for a number of reasons, not least of which Dan Gurney is for those of you who don't know who Dan Gurney is, was a famous race car driver, an incredibly successful race car driver and eventually team owner, and I think one of only a few drivers in the history of auto racing to win a Formula One race and an IndyCar race and a NASCAR race and a sports car race or something like that. Like he won in all these disciplines. He was an incredible driver, and Eagle Westlake and whatever. The point is he came up with this idea, and I still don't actually think I know why. Like, was it like a low center of gravity thing? Like, do you remember what the deal was?
I believe that's what it was, because if you like, this isn't
okay. And
sorry, it's like people race this, right? Like,
so
it's
hang
supposed
on,
to be fast.
Before we get into too much, to try to describe it, it's a motorcycle that is sort of standard at the front and at the back, but in the middle, instead of the seat being something like 30 inches or 32 inches off the ground like a normal motorcycle, in between the wheels where you sit is scooped out almost like a step through of a scooter. So you sit down and the seat height is probably 12 inches or something. I mean, you sit like a foot off the ground.
When we say the front and the rear look traditional, it looks like a sport bike. It looks like a 90s sport bike that Honda would have made.
Like a Yamaha Seca or something like that.
Yeah. So it's not like a traditional cruiser. It's definitely a traditional sport bike look. But then it's got forward-mounted controls, so you're putting your feet straight out in front of you as you sit down in the motorcycle, and then you're reaching forward for the handlebars.
So imagine, you may have seen a recumbent bicycle where like someone like lays down and they pedal, like pedal with their feet out in front of them, and the handlebars are either like off to the side or just in front of them, kind of above their knees, and they lay down and I don't know exactly why, but they often have a flag sticking up so people don't run them over. The point is, this is kind of what it is. It's like a recumbent motorcycle, basically, and it is extremely strange. And I don't think you're off base, Spurgeon, by calling it the ugliest bike ever.
I love it. I think it's fantastic. Look at this thing.
Of course you do. Of course you do.
It's amazing. I have all the same questions, though, largely revolving around why and how. And I am so glad that I'm learning about this today, because I have a whole rabbit hole to dive down.
Spencer would like to change his pick for the best looking motorcycle of all time.
Yes.
And choose the Gurney Alligator.
And hopefully the best looking motorcycle I've ever owned. Just saying.
There we go.
Any alligator owners out there?
So the reason I saw this, or the reason that this one kind of, when I was doing my research, Abby, our friend at Bike Curious, I think there's one of these that are currently being auctioned, and it was like he had the link for the auction.
Spencer, there you go.
I think it might be out of your price range, though, Spencer. There were only 36 of these made, and I think knowing your caviar dreams, but your toast taste, your toast willingness to spend.
Look at what I can trade. I can trade my Honda Shadow 500. That's a pretty good down payment, I'd like to think.
Yeah.
Well, that's an interesting pick, Spurge, I gotta say, and it's very interesting because the pick that Spencer has for ugliest bike of all time, and Spurgeon, your pick for ugliest bike of all time, both have. So I have a short list that I'm sort of like running and gunning here. I was going to go with my pick at the last minute, kind of, and you're both on the same track that I was on with multiples. Like I have at least one bike from my list each that would match up with yours quite nicely, I think. So now I'm torn. I think I'm going to go with the BMW C1.
Okay, now I don't know what that is.
With the C1?
Yeah,
I'm not.
I know the C1.
Okay.
The C1 is sort of...
Oh, it looks like that.
Spurgeon just pulled up a picture.
No, what? It's like something like a security guard at a mall would drive around. There's a windshield wiper on it. That's
there's
insane.
A windshield wiper. It's a very unfortunate motorbike.
All right, you have to describe this before we go into opinions on this.
So,
like, how do you?
So it's basically a scooter. It's a late '90s scooter. That's sort of like, bulbous in some areas.
It had sex with a rascal. It was like a scooter had sex with a rascal, and they bred this thing.
So yeah, it's sort of a late '90s scooter looking thing. But its main feature that I don't know if you would call it a feature. It essentially has a roof. It has a windshield and a roof. It has a very narrow scooter width windshield that goes up over the rider's head and connects behind to the sort of seat, which is extra tall in the back to accept it looks like it has a roll cage almost, and it has a roof. And then it has a windshield in front, which has a windshield wiper. So you can sort of imagine the idea, right? Like, a scooter is like very convenient. You can just like step through it. And to all the, what was the Italian designer's name? Ascario Jabario? Discagno. So Discagno's idea of, a woman with a dress can step in, or a skirt, and can step in and ride this motorbike. And so the C1 offers that scooter practicality, except it has a roof, so you don't get wet when it rains, theoretically. And it eventually came with like a little box that instead of a passenger seat behind the little roof setup, so it had like extra storage. But it has a square headlight, I think, right?
But there is a passenger seat out behind it, so like the passenger has to sit out back getting wet in the rain while you're under your little roof.
There were probably some pretty unfortunate scenes at some point, where someone bought one of these and they were like commuting across Vienna, and they're like, "No, it's okay, I can pick you up." And then
do they sit backwards on that seat?
No,
I think
the passenger pegs are right below. But you don't
Right.
put your hand around the person the way you would on a motorcycle. There's like
you
hand
sort of hold
grips.
on to.
And then you
So
just put
you-
your face at the back of the.
You put your face
Yeah,
at the back of the window.
That's
I
awful.
can't look
windshield.
away. So Zach, if you're listening, Zach is describing this, and I keep looking to my left because we have it pulled up on a big screen over here, and I can't look away. It's like a train wreck. It's horrible.
It's
Oh.
it's very, very strange, and I think that it's I don't know.
Is it a telelever front fork too?
No, it's just a typical scooter fork where there's a steering stem that goes down. So there's no upper triple clamp. It's just there's one triple clamp for the fork, and then there's a single stem that goes up through the scooter chassis.
Okay.
Yeah. So what do you think, Spencer?
Well, yeah, I remember reading about this bike at some point. I, in general, have a soft spot for extremely weird bikes. So even the K1 that I pointed out, I have a soft spot for weird designs. And I think the C1 is a good example of that, where it's heinous. It's a great pick for ugliest motorcycle ever made. And a nice inverse to the Vespa, prettiest
Exactly.
and ugliest and on the scooter
Right.
front.
Right,
But
right.
what I remember reading about the C1 is that it was pretty underpowered, and they basically added a ton of weight to a scooter, didn't really give it any more power, so it was like pretty dicey in the rain. It was just like generally kind of difficult to ride. So it's this weird thing where they wanted to make scooters or motorcycles more accessible to people, and just like, oh, it's basically a car but it's a motorcycle, and they have like a C1 executive so that business people can drive them around in our utopian future. But I think I've never ridden one, but it seems like they probably made them challenging to ride in a way where that was half the problem, of people like getting in and being like, oh my God, I'm going to tip over and then I have a whole roof that's going to fall on the ground.
Just look
Spurgeon
at that.
can't
Wow.
resist. He must show this photo to.
It's a photo of like what the passenger looks like on the back, and she's smiling. She looks like she's having a good time, but like, oh, well, how
That
dorky
also
is that?
that photo is a perfect reminder to me. So the photo Spurgeon just showed, as he said, there was a passenger out back, and the passenger has a helmet, but the driver does not have a helmet. And I also remember reading something about how BMW like lobbied super hard to not have a helmet law apply to this, because I think there was a seatbelt.
There's a
Isn't there
seatbelt. There's a
that you wear?
seatbelt. There's a seatbelt.
because
Yep.
the seat goes up pretty high in the back. It's not
Yeah.
like a typical motorcycle seat where it ends at your tailbone basically, or your lower back. It goes up to your sort of mid back, or because it like we said, it connects over to that roof.
Yeah.
So you could have a harness in there, which is very frightening.
Yeah, but they tried to create this whole new segment of motorcycling where they're like, oh yeah, it looks like a motorcycle, but you don't have to wear a helmet, and it has a windshield and windshield wipers, and like, again, BMW has I would say a storied history of shaking the Etch-a-Sketch in a way that is not particularly successful. But yeah, I don't hate that they try new stuff.
I agree. Bless the company. So we made a video years ago, Spencer and I and Ari, about the BMW GS, and one of the upshots at the end of it was, so one of the things we started off with was when the BMW GS came out, a lot of people sort of thought, what a terrible idea. What a terrible idea to try to make a street bike a little bit dirt worthy. It's just awful. It doesn't work as a dirt bike. It's too heavy. It's terrible. Start to finish, it's terrible.
And look at
Right,
us
and
now.
it's the worst of
Look at
both
us now.
worlds.
Exactly. It's the worst of both worlds instead of the best of both worlds, and they didn't get it. And there were lots of articles we read from first rides of the GS in 1980 of people saying like, I don't know what they were smoking. This is terrible. And of course, look at us now with the GS. It has not only become a flagship for BMW, but has created a segment essentially, and everyone is trying to catch up with the sales success of the GS. So I love when companies do something that's weird. I appreciate that. I think it's necessary, and I think they should always be applauded for doing that kind of thing. And I think the BMW C1 is a perfect example. However, it remains my pick for ugliest motorcycle of all time.
Well, go ahead, Spurge.
I was just going to say that I so far have agreed with both of you. I think both of you have picked some delightfully ugly motorcycles. But I do want to mention some of the honorable picks that were thrown out here.
Yeah.
Because,
Let's go down a little lightning round here because there's so many to choose from.
But what I would say is, while I agree with the two of you, there were some picks made by our colleagues that I actually disagree with. So
Well,
Yeah.
any chance to disagree with a colleague is always one we should take.
Especially when they're not here to defend themselves.
Perfect.
Oh, I know. I'm looking at the list now, and I know which one you're going to take issue with. Believe me.
No, it's not what you think. I know
Okay.
I know what you're thinking. You're thinking Lance's pick, and it's not Lance's pick.
Okay.
The one that Ari Henning picked the Honda Valkyrie Rune. Now, for
yeah.
those
Honda
of you
Rune.
that don't know what we're talking about, this was it was a 6-cylinder engine, right? It was the Goldwing engine, correct?
Yeah, it's
Yep.
a Goldwing engine.
Yeah.
Yep.
But it was this massive cruiser-looking monstrosity with
Longest wheelbase of a Honda motorcycle ever made, from what I read.
the ads were awesome. It was all of these like Viking-looking dudes with swords, like just great ad campaign from when Honda used to take risks. And I used to work at a motorcycle dealership, and the owner of the dealership loved these bikes. He collected them. Anytime we'd go to auctions, he would always keep his eyes out to buy extra ones and just hoard them away. And honestly, when you see them in person, when you get a chance to ride them, there's a lot of technology going on. But really, from an aesthetic point, I think they're cool. I think they look cool. I think they've aged well. I think they're weird. And this gets back to what you were saying, Spencer. Sometimes like the weird things, I kind of gravitate towards. But I disagree. I think the Rune is a cool looking motorcycle.
Interesting.
I think
what
the
do you
Rune-
think, Spencer?
Yeah, the Rune reminds me, I don't know if this was the exact same era, but the Rune feels like it is part of that same trend that happened where car manufacturers had like, there was the Chevy SSR, there was the Plymouth Prowler, there was the PT Cruiser. It was these like kind of odd throwback machines that were weird
Right.
and bulbous and not necessarily super functional, but like they were just super popular for a hot minute. And my favorite Rune tidbit that I recall is that allegedly the myth of the Rune is that Honda sold them at a loss for like 75, like apparently they cost $100,000 to manufacture and they sold them for like $25,000. And from Honda's perspective, they didn't make that many of them, but I read that it was basically just like a marketing thing for them, that they chalked it up to whatever, some tens or hundreds of millions of dollar marketing exercise to just build this outlandish motorcycle at a loss just to basically get headlines for doing something outlandish, which again, I don't know if that's true, but if it is, I kind of respect the play.
But see, the thing is, like, they might have had an MSRP of $25,000, but people weren't paying that. Like, they were only for sale for like a year and a half, and they sat on dealership floors. Like, they couldn't give them away. But then, like, there was this little cult following that started to happen around them. And I think we might have actually talked about this in one of our earlier podcast episodes on cult bikes. But now, if you find one that pops up at auction or for sale, they typically sell for quite a bit of money because they are so rare. They only had them out for like a year and a half.
Yeah, I think there's a lot wrong with the way that this bike looks. The weird fender that goes too far down in the back, and it had a trailing link front end, I think.
Yeah.
Or a leading link front end. I always get those mixed up.
Yeah,
I think it's
something.
trailing
Yeah.
link. Oh no, leading link. Anyway, the point is, it had a funky front end, which sort of like accentuated the oddity of it when you look at it and you're like, what is going on there? Like, what happened? The Rune to me is sort of like the bad tattoo of, you know, it's the tattoo that someone got in 1999 and they're like, probably shouldn't have done that, but it's a choice I made. And
That's Patrick Garvin's pick. Patrick Garvin's pick is the bad tattoo pick. And I like your analogy, but that's Patrick Garvin went with the Orange County Choppers Comanche. And I feel
Yeah.
like the entire chopper craze of the 2000s is the bad tattoo pick.
Yeah, I would agree. But also, like, is the Comanche even the ugliest bike that Orange County Choppers has made?
It
Like,
seems
how do you
impossible. The ceiling of ugliness for that custom bike craze is just so
my
high.
God.
I don't know.
It's so high. And
Yeah.
For those of you who aren't familiar with the Comanche, I'm not actually looking at a picture of it right now, but the Comanche is the one that's sort of like, it almost looks like like it's designed to avoid radar. Like it's very like angular, like black panels, and it's all kind of like matte black with like a weird shaped headlight, and it's all raked out and kind of like bizarre angles everywhere. And
Yeah,
it's
it was
very
kind of
strange.
like I think it was like supposed to be helicopter themed, right? Like because it looks like everything's been like riveted
See, I didn't
together.
even put that together. I don't
Yeah. It's not a pretty bike, but again, like Spencer said, when you're looking at that whole craze, how do you find that? That's like trying to find the ugliest one. Just would be an all day affair.
True. So to bring it back around a little bit more mainstream, I'd like to talk about our colleague Jen Dunstan and our colleague Lance Oliver. They have some picks that are much more mainstream and arguably a little more controversial. Not least of which, Lance Oliver, who says KTM 890 Duke.
So what people have to know, Lance Oliver, for those of you that have never listened to the podcast before and are not familiar with the Silver Fox, he is our managing editor of Common Tread. And Lance has got a real adverse opinion when it comes to any of the modern angular designs. He hates an MT10. He does not like any of these sharp edges that you're starting to see come into motorcycle design. So it really doesn't surprise me that a KTM 890 Duke is on his list as a pick here.
But definitely not the ugliest KTM they've ever made.
Oh, I agree. I don't think I'm not going to sit here and defend it as a pretty bike, but like I think the 890 kind of looks cool. But again, I know Lance. I can be in Lance's head, and it's a mess in there.
I think that I got big problems with KTM design language. As like I said, I picked my bike as ugliest bike I've ever owned. It's the probably the motorcycle that I love the most, and yet I picked it as being kind of ugly. And an 890 Duke is a great bike, but you do have to come around to to like the way that they
you can't ride it. You can't see it while you ride it. That's your mantra, right, Zach?
Yeah, that's what I had a guy tell me that one time. I told him how much I liked my bike, and he was looking at it, and he said, "Well, at least you don't have to look at it while you're riding it."
Well, in fairness, it's like I do like their adventure bike aesthetic. Like the 1090 that I owned, I thought was a really good looking bike. I'm not saying that you have to agree with me. You rarely do. But the hard part about me selling that bike was, I don't think it looks as good as an 890 does. I think the 890 is a very ugly machine. But now we're getting into a separate podcast of like which one is functionally better, and I don't want to. We
are so. Certainly. So Jen Dunstan's pick was the Suzuki Gladius. Which, if you're not familiar with the Gladius, was this interesting midlife crisis that the SV650 went through, where it was there was the original SV, which was very popular, and then it went fuel injected, and it was very popular, and it continued to be very popular, and then for some reason Suzuki said, now it's a Gladius, and it was. They did this weird kind of like swoopy futuristic stuff with the fairing, and like at its core was still recognizable as an SV650. It was just an upright, naked, mid-sized motorcycle, but instead of having a round headlight, it had this weird like drip of alien snot.
It was like melting. It was like the headlight was melting into the front.
Yeah, I think what Jen put in her notes was it looks like a sad piece of soap or something like that, which I think is pretty accurate. It's interesting that I think. What I think is most interesting about her pick is that I don't actually think that by itself the Gladius is that offensive to be the ugliest bike ever, but the reason she picked it, I think, is that it's so offensive for what it did to a bike that everyone loved, right? Like it was not really that big a change aesthetically. It's not like they put a sidecar on it or like changed the bike entirely. Like at its core, it was basically the same functionally, but it shifted in a way that was damaging to people. Really hurt everyone's feelings.
All of the other bikes that we picked, I think, for ugliest bike, they were all trying to do something completely new, right? I mean, C1, brand new model. K1, kind of an update, but essentially an experimentation or an experiment. And the alligator? The Gurney Gator, brand new thing they're trying. I agree with the assessment that the Gladius is offensive because of the context of it once being a very decent looking motorcycle
and revered. Yeah,
exactly. Very highly respected, highly loved motorcycle. So it is pretty tragic to see. But
I would just say that if depending on how far we could have gone down the list of best looking motorcycles ever, that second generation SV650 with the round headlight, but a little bit more of a sharp line and cut to it than the first gen was probably one of my picks for one of the best looking bikes of all time, especially depending on what price category you were considering. Because for a long time, you could get an SV650 for like $3,000, and it was a great looking motorcycle for the money. If the Gladius would have not come out of that, I agree with you, Zach. I think the Gladius was an okay looking motorcycle for what it was, but it's what it did to the SV650 that offends so many of us.
Yep.
I do want to end on this because we are getting close to 2 hours. So I think we've proved to ourselves that we could do a part 2 of this and not run out of things to talk about. But I want to end on Brandon's pick because I didn't know what this was. And I don't know if you guys have looked up Brandon's pick. Brandon picked a Yohammer J1. Did you guys know what this is?
I only looked at it because he brought it up. I had never heard of it, and it's I think it goes outside of our as I went outside the rule of like production and mass. Like I had never even. I mean, how many of these are there? What did it does it even real? There's a picture of it. I guess it's real.
$34,000. Apparently, you can buy one, but it's I don't even know how to describe this.
It's very strange. It's sort of like it almost looks like a unibody, like 3D printed motorcycle where it's all one piece with the rear wheels under a big shroud. And it's sort of like wrinkled like it was dipped in water and then set out in the sun. And then it has a hub steering kind of like front swing arm situation. But
the mirrors are, Spencer, were you able to find a picture of this?
Yeah, I'm looking at it now. It's really something.
I don't even. It
looks like a snail. It's got
yes.
The mirrors are like eyes up here, and then it has this
that's it. It looks like a snail.
Body.
Yes. So yeah, I would say that if you have never given yourself the joy of letting your peepers gaze upon the inglory, disgusting style of a Yohammer J1, go ahead and pull that up on your smartphone and take a look at that. So. But
yeah. Okay. Well, I agree. I would love to pick up this conversation again. I think there's lots more stuff to talk about with regard to, why motorcycles look good and why they don't, and so on and so forth. But I think we should probably let you gracious listeners get on with the rest of your day, and let Spencer get on with the rest of his day.
Yeah, so we're gonna bid Spencer adieu. We're gonna thank him for joining us for this conversation, and then we are going to wrap out this episode with some High Side listeners' comments. But first, Spencer, thank you for joining us today.
Good pick, Spencer.
Thanks, guys. I appreciate it. This is fun being here.
Okie doke. Spenser Roberts, ladies and gentlemen. Always a pleasure to have him on talking about bikes. I've enjoyed that. The movie discussion was good. This discussion was good. Maybe he's good at the discussions.
I would say that
in podcasting.
For a guy that's normally behind the scenes as the producer of content, he really does shine when you just put a camera right in his face.
That's true. It's true. Okay, so we have taken up a lot of time already. We're going to try and hustle through these comments a little bit. We do have some fun comments to talk to, remind you of the t-shirt winners, and then let you get on with your day. So would you take it away, Spurge, with the first first comment?
So these comments come in via email. So if you want to comment and want to have Zach and I look through your comments, you can always shoot us an email to highsidelowside@RevZilla.com. You can leave a comment for us on YouTube as well. So the first one is from John, and I'm going to try and paraphrase this a little bit, but he goes, I was listening to your live show and the subject of future motorcycle advancements came up. I was surprised that you gurus, I'm sensing a little bit of sarcasm here, John, you gurus missed the opportunity to promote crash worthiness. This is on nobody's radar in the industry, even after much research has been done on the subject. The motorcycle industry is extremely behind in the crash worthiness of their design of their products compared to cars. You can get an IIHS crash rating for literally any car out there, none for motorcycles. And then he went on to critique the fact that we came close to discussing this with the Goldwings airbag system. However, our conversation came off as if it was a gimmick, whereas he feels that airbags are potentially, and these are his words, the silver bullet for frontal collision protection on motorcycles, in John's opinion.
Well, this is interesting because I think we haven't considered that ever. We haven't really ever talked about that. But why Spurgeon why not assume if there's a highway safety standard for cars that you can look up and the cars are rated, why not rate motorcycles as well? And why not use them?
So this is one of those comments that kind of came through and kind of stumped Zach and I, because I've sat down and thought about what adventure bikes crash better than others as far as like I can pick them back up and keep riding. But I don't.
Right.
But typically when we're talking about IIHS safety ratings in cars, it's about the car keeping you safe. You can crash a car and then walk away from the accident. But typically with motorcycles, when you think about the fact that motorcycles don't have seatbelts, it's because you don't want to be strapped to a motorcycle when it's sliding down the road or it starts to roll. You want to have the motorcycle get away from you. So the whole nature of how you crash on a motorcycle is different of how you crash in a car. The car is there to keep you safe. You're in a cage that is designed to protect you. When you crash a motorcycle, the idea is you want to get away from the motorcycle. Like, let that motorcycle go and let it go do what it's going to do, but you want to be wearing safety gear, and we do have safety ratings associated with the gear you wear,
right,
not the motorcycle. So I think, from John's standpoint, I understand what he's saying, but with motorcycles, you wear gear that keeps you safe. You don't rely on the vehicle to keep you safe.
Yes,
Is that
I think
pretty
that's
fair?
correct. And
okay.
Yes, this is a good explanation. Hopefully, it makes sense, John, and anyone else who is curious. And yeah, airbags on a motorcycle. If you're riding a big touring bike like a Goldwing, and you are going 50 or 60 miles an hour, and you rear end a car going 30 or 40 miles an hour, you just smash into the back of that car. Yeah, an airbag that goes off in front of you and could potentially catch you. That there's something to be said for that. But there are lots of other ways that motorcycles crash, and to Spurgeon's point, in those ways it's so much harder to delineate what makes sense to keep the rider safe and what doesn't. But what we are seeing is airbag systems for riders, like an airbag system that goes around your torso and covers your hips and collarbones and shoulders and chest and back when if you crash. And I think that seems to be the mode that motorcycling is going, is obviously to protect the rider, since it's so much less clear how the human body reacts when a motorcycle crashes. So hopefully that makes some sense, John.
And I would say, John, I want to thank you for the comment, because it did get us
Yes.
thinking. And again, there's if you're looking at CE ratings on motorcycle gear, obviously, Zach and I both work for RevZilla, so we're pretty familiar with some of these new innovations, and a lot of it's coming out of Europe. America in general really doesn't have a lot of requirements on the safety apparel that you have to wear in the same way that Europe does. But a lot of these designers are designing most of their gear that it can pass those ratings to the European standard, and thus we're getting the benefit of that. So great question, John. But Zach, why don't you take us on to comment number 2?
Comment number 2 is from James, who sent us a couple emails over the course of some amount of time. I'm not sure. And again, we'll paraphrase because James had a lot to say. And we'll preface this by saying thank you so much for being in touch, James. Really appreciate it, because again, it got us thinking. So here goes. James said, basically, one bone he has to pick with the motorcycle industry is, why is there this whole vernacular around graduating from a motorcycle, or being ready for the next motorcycle, or bigger is better, or there's no replacement for displacement, or someday you'll get to be able to ride that bigger bike. And he admits, I understand that manufacturers want people to graduate because that means spending more money and buying more new bikes, that kind of thing. But one of his questions is like, why can't you just be happy with the bike that you have? Why can't you just have a small bike or a medium-sized bike or whatever bike fits you or whatever, and then just be happy with that? And then he's a follow-up point that James made was, he feels like the culture of motorcycling is really fragmented and weird, and like, if you don't wear this kind of jacket, then you can't fit into this type of motorcycling. And if you don't have this kind of bike, then you can't fit into this kind of motorcycling. And like, he doesn't feel like he represents with any of that. So those are sort of the 2 main points. Hopefully we're characterizing your emails correctly, James. Thank you again for sending in. But maybe we'll cover the first one first, Spencer. Spurgeon.
Spencer. I'm not nearly that handsome. Come on.
You both start with SP, and I always get confused. I do this around the office all the time. So Spurge, the first bit of that is sort of like, why is it always safe you have to graduate to the next thing?
I agree with you 100%, James, and I think this is something that Zach and I have tried to argue. I don't know if I want to say argue in favor of or argue against, depending on how you're reading his question. But I mean, one of the only bikes in my garage that I won't sell is my old Triumph Bonneville T100, and it makes 55 horsepower. I've done so much with it, and I can still get on that bike and have so much fun. I argue for a Z400 as a bike that I can still get on and ride and have a great time on.
Right.
I think there's so many bikes out there. You don't have to go to the bigger, the best, the faster, the fastest to have a good time. And I would argue, Zach, you probably agree with me on that. I think that we've talked about this ad nauseum. I think maybe, James, if you're feeling that pressure, or if you think that that's what people are saying, maybe you're just hanging out with the wrong people. I don't know, because I've never felt pressure from my peers to go out and buy something bigger.
I think to James's point, there is often a sort of feeling like that, right? Like if you have a Z400 or a Z650, there's this sort of like natural inclination for people to say like, oh, well, when are you going to get the bigger one? Like when are you going to get a Z900 or a Z1000 or a Ducati Street Fighter? Like when are you going to graduate to the next thing? You know, like when are you moving up? And you know, I think that another way to look at this is if you have a picture of a whatever, what am I trying to say here? A Ducati Street Fighter V4 on your wall, right? You're like, this is the ultimate to me. Like this is the 200 horsepower naked bike with aerodynamic wings. And like, that's the bike that I want to ride and own. But you don't have a license at the time, or you just got your license or whatever. You can't afford it. Whatever the thing is, if that's your dream bike, to have that like ultimate power, or like to aspire to that because it's sort of the ultimate expression of a Street Fighter,
or just because you like the way it looks. I mean, that's what this whole episode. Yeah,
exactly. Then it's, if you're coming at it from that angle, someone would hopefully tell you the advice you would get would be, well, start with something smaller. You know, start with a Z400 or a Z650 or whatever, a CBR 300, a CBR 650, like something like that, something smaller.
A Hayabusa, yeah,
exactly. So if that's where you're coming from, like you always wanted to be able to ride your dream bike, which is this super fast thing, then there's always going to be a natural kind of like, oh, well, I'm looking forward to moving up. But to Spurgeon's point, you shouldn't ever feel pressured to get something that you don't want. If you have a bike that's small or medium sized or overweight or slow or fast or whatever the thing is that other people don't seem to agree with, you don't have to apologize for that. You can ride whatever bike you want to ride, and it should be absolutely good enough.
And that gets into your second point, James, where you're talking about the subgroups and that there's this pressure to belong. And I was talking about this. We were doing an Instagram live the other day, and we had Liz Canary on, who's one of our Riders Alliance riders. And Liz was talking about the fact that if she could go back and tell her younger self, one tip, it would be, don't worry about what other people think. Don't worry about being embarrassed. Go out and have the experience. You want to do a track day? Go out and do the track day. And if you don't have the gear, you can rent the gear. And if you don't have a bike, you can rent the bike. If you want to go ride off-road, but you just have a bunch of used gear that your buddy passed you down, wear the gear that you have. Don't feel like you have to look a certain part or have a certain bike to be able to go out and have these experiences. And James, I think you're right in the fact that there are pressure in certain situations, but I think a lot of that pressure we put on ourselves because we're nervous about just starting off. And I guess if I could leave anybody out there listening to this with any final piece of information here, it's like, don't worry about it. Everybody had to start somewhere. Everybody was in that situation. And by and large, motorcyclists are inclusive people, and we're going to welcome you in, and we're not going to judge you for the jacket or the gear or whatever it is that you're wearing or not wearing.
Right. Certainly the upshot here is that you should be riding motorcycles, participating in the pastime that you enjoy because you like it. And if someone tells you that you don't fit in with them, or you don't fit in with other people, or that you look silly, that's their problem, not your problem. And you should continue to participate in motorcycling. You should continue to do the thing that makes you happy, and do it in the way that makes you happy, so long as you are abiding by local laws and so on and so forth.
And you walk right up to that person that is making you feel bad, and you said Spurgeon and Zach said to off, and then you show them your high side low side t-shirt. And I'll say this, James, normally we don't send out high side low side t-shirts to the comments, but you did talk about the fact that you dated my dad in the 70s. I don't believe it because my dad doesn't know you, James, but you obviously listen to the live episode. You're obviously a high side low side listener, so James, go ahead, shoot us a third email with your information, and we will make sure that you get a t-shirt. And Zach, I think with that, we're pretty much done another successful episode of season 5.
Well, the success remains to be seen, but we're finished with it anyway. And if you're still listening, thank you so much for sticking around for this episode of High Side, Low Side. It sure was fun. We sure do hope that we can revisit this whole idea of motorcycle aesthetics, because boy, did we have a lot to say. Friendly reminder, for T. Robbins 6 and I Dozen, winners of the t-shirts earlier in the podcast, to send your mailing address and preferred t-shirt size to highsidelowside at RevZilla.com. And to everyone else, please do feel free to leave an Apple Podcast review, and you could be selected to win a very own t-shirt of your own. And
a very own t-shirt of your own. There's so many owns in that sentence. I love
too many owns. It's like I'm not good at this. Who knew?
Thank you guys for joining us again for another episode of High Side, Low Side, and I guess we'll see you for episode 3.
Thanks, everybody. See ya.